Chapter 031 marked. Zorian stared at the grinning face of his opponent, his own face a blank, expressionless mask. This was it. This last round would decide who the victor was, no question about it. His opponent thought he had Zorian backed into a corner, but Zorian had a secret weapon. He had already peered into the man's thoughts and knew that he had already won. The rules of the card game were pretty clear, after all. 12 of pumpkins, Zorian said, placing his last card on the table. The man's face instantly lost its grin. Zorian tried to keep a cool facade, but he probably smiled at least a little. Mother, how are you this lucky? The man cursed, slapping down his own card on top of the stack, a measly 7 of oaks, not nearly enough to win, and taking a swig from the glass of hard liquor next to him. He drank way too much in Zorian's opinion, his thoughts steadily growing more and more muddy to Zorian's mental probes as time went by. And while that did make him harder to read via psychic powers, it also made him progressively worse at playing the game. He probably didn't even need to cheat to win the last 2 games, but cheating was kind of the whole point. He joined the card game to practice his mind-reading skills in a real environment, not to win money off hapless victims. Well, this is it for me, Zorian said, standing up. It was fun and all, but I really have to get going now. Hey, you can't just leave now, the man protested, frowning at him. That's not how it's done. You have to give me a chance to win my money back. Arenas, you're drunk, one of the other men at the table said. The 2 of them dropped out 3 games ago, but they still stuck around to talk, drink, and act as judges and money holders. You didn't lose anything. It's the kid who just got back the money he lost to you in the previous game. Nobody has to pay anyone anything. Yeah, the last 5 games have basically been for nothing, the other man piped in. Zorian nodded. Even with mind-reading on his side, some hands were just unwinnable. Besides, he purposely threw a couple of games so as to not arouse suspicions of cheating in his partners. We're both even at this point, and I really have to get going, so it's a perfect place to stop, he said. Still, if you're that desperate for a rematch, I can always relieve you of your money some other day. I'll be staying in the town for a whole month anyway. You relieve me of my money, huh? The only reason you haven't ended up in your underwear is that you're immune to my secret technique. Arenas half shouted. The other man snorted in amusement. Getting the newbie drunk is a secret technique, now? Hey man, don't reveal all my tricks to outsiders. What kind of friend are you? Arenas protested. After a few more minutes of bickering and refused offers of alcoholic beverages, Zorian finally managed to excuse himself. Ignoring Arenas's muttered questioning of Zorian's masculinity due to his refusal to drink anything remotely alcoholic, he left the inn and started searching the streets of Nyazovt very far an out-of-the-way corner he could teleport from without being seen. The game had been both unexpectedly fun and useful for his mind magic training, but he hadn't been lying when he had said he had to get going. Timing was crucial for what he intended to do. In the previous restart he learned that most of the soul mages on Kale's list had disappeared or died recently. That was, of course, highly suspicious. There was a good chance the whole thing was somehow connected to the time loop, which meant he had to know more about it. Sadly, during the last restart he had made the mistake of telling Vanny about the disappearances, and he had raised enough of an alarm to have the police crawling everywhere around potential clue sites. Consequently, Zorian had been forced to set the issue aside and wait for the next restart to conduct his own investigation. Which is exactly what he did, the moment he woke up in Surin and could leave without making Mother and Kirill throw a fit. As he suspected, virtually all of the soul mages had been already gone, even on that very first day. Whatever had happened to them had been going on for far longer than the time loop existed, it seemed. There were only 2 exceptions. The 2 mages that were confirmed dead in the previous restart were alive and well at the start of the new one. The first one, a priest named Alanik Zosk specializing in fighting undead, had simply been found dead with no obvious cause a few days into the restart. The second one was Lukav Teklo, an alchemist specializing in transformation magic. He had been killed by boars not far from his home, on the evening of the second day of the restart. Naturally, Zorian intended to talk with both of them, which necessitated saving their lives. The alchemist was a priority, as he died sooner and the cause of death was known and easily preventable. Thus his hurry to leave the game. If he timed things correctly, he would arrive at the man's home an hour or two before his fateful stroll outside the village. If he mistimed things or his actions somehow caused the alchemist to accelerate his schedule, well, there were always future restarts. It's not like the man would die for good. He could have contacted the man sooner to warn him, he supposed, but how would he explain his knowledge of the attack? He'd just make himself look suspicious. And besides, he actually wanted the attack to happen. He doubted those were regular boars that attacked him, so he wanted to examine them up close. And also, the man was bound to be a lot more helpful if he met Zorian as a savior who protected him from a vicious pack of boars than if he just showed up at the man's door with no warning. After teleporting just outside the man's house and making sure the alchemist was still in his house, Zorian settled in for a wait, making sure to keep out of sight of any windows. If there was anything that tiny villages like this one never had a shortage of, it was nosy old people who had nothing better to do except watch the streets for anything out of the ordinary. Honestly, some of the old women back in Certain spent practically every waking moment glued to their windowsills, making note of everyone that passed through their domain. He lost count of the number of times they got him into trouble with his parents when he had foolishly forgotten to account for their presence. He didn't have to wait long. Barely half an hour after he had settled in to wait, the alchemist left his house. It was a good thing he had come early, then. Zorian promptly cast an invisibility spell on himself and then started following after the man some distance away. Hopefully he remained far enough that the man would not find it suspicious when Zorian burst onto the scene at the first sign of trouble, but that couldn't be helped. He didn't feel comfortable putting even more distance between the two of them, lest the man be killed before he could come to his aid. Depending on how oblivious and combat-capable the man was, he could get overwhelmed in seconds. And the attack itself was bound to happen any moment now. The report he saw in the last restart said the man was killed just outside the village, and LeCave had immediately made a beeline towards the main road leading to the next settlement. Cautiously, Zorian drew his spell rod and strained his mind sense to the limit in order to find the attackers before they could strike. He found nothing out of the ordinary, and was thus just as shocked as the alchemist when a bunch of boars burst out of the tree line and charged the man. They both froze for a second, and before either could react the boars had already closed half of the distance to the alchemist. Embarrassingly enough, the alchemist reacted first. With a practiced movement, he threw a bottle of some sort into the path of the approaching horde and immediately dropped on the ground. Lacking the alchemist's reflexes and thinking himself too far to be affected by the bomb, Zorian opted to simply drop invisibility and erect a shield in front of him as a precaution. That turned out to be a mistake, as the deafening explosion of light and sound left him dazed and blinking spots out of his vision for the next few seconds. When he did recover, he saw that the bomb's effect on the boars themselves had been underwhelming. They had been thrown about by the blast, as had the alchemist himself, having misjudged the distance somewhat in his panic, and the leading boar that had been caught in the center of the blast had been blown to bits, but the others were already up on their feet and converging on their target. Even the one with a broken leg was stubbornly stumbling towards the dazed, bleeding alchemist, undeterred by what should have been excruciating pain. They made no sounds, they were unafraid of loud sounds and bright light, and completely ignored severe injuries like they were nothing. So much for the idea that they were ordinary animals. Oh well, he kind of suspected it was something like this. Acting quickly to stop them from killing the other man, he cast a swarm of 5 magic missiles at the boars closest to the downed alchemist. Smashers instead of piercers. If he was right about what these things really were, holes in their bodies wouldn't even slow them down. The missiles were there just to knock them away from their target and give Zorian time to cast another, more unorthodox spell that he didn't put in his spell rod. Oh, and possibly shift their attention towards him instead, though he didn't think anything could make them switch targets. They were clearly sent to kill a specific mon. The smashers hit the boars in their flanks, sending them tumbling. As he suspected, they immediately scrambled to get up as if nothing happened, and the other four kept running towards the alchemist. He had finished his spell before they could reach him, however, causing a large shining disk of force to materialize between his hands. The severing disk was a powerful cutting spell that was surprisingly mana-efficient and allowed the caster to pilot the disk, changing its flight path at will. Taven had not thought much of it, as it was not a fire-and-forget sort of combat spell, requiring constant concentration from the mage to keep existing. And it moved pretty slowly for a magical projectile, too. According to Taven, competent mages would dispel the disk before it could reach them or otherwise evade it, and the caster is something of a sitting duck while directing the disk. But the boars couldn't dispel it, and had no ranged attacks to take advantage of his lack of shields. At Zorian's direction, the disk shot forward, flying close to the ground, at the height that Zorian judged to be around knee-height for the boars. Zorian's fears that he had overestimated the power of the disk and that it would not be able to cut through the bones of tough animals like the boars proved completely unfounded. The disk encountered the legs of the first boar and simply passed through with no visible resistance. In its wake, the boar fell apart, its legs separated from its torso. Directed by Zorian, the disk continued towards the rest of them. In the end, it was a close thing. On one hand, the boars didn't even try to dodge, charging in straight lines that made them easy to intercept with the disk. On the other hand, Zorian had not practiced the spell in question particularly heavily, so he missed 2 boars on his first pass. Thankfully, the alchemist had recovered by this point and helpfully dealt with the 2 stragglers by causing an arc of spear-like spikes to erupt from the ground in front of him with some kind of alteration spell. The boars were so insistent on getting to him as fast as possible that they impaled themselves on the makeshift rampart and got stuck. Zorian let the disk dissipate with a sigh. That was a win, yes, but he wasn't satisfied with his performance. He'd frozen at the start, and his mastery of the severing disk spell left much to be desired. But what was done, and at least he achieved what he came here to do. Time to face the music. He set off towards the alchemist, who was kneeling on the ground and alternating between staring at the approaching Zorian and at the still twitching, legless boars not far from him. He frowned at them as he approached. They had no minds, he realized. That was why he didn't detect them until they attacked. As far as his mind sense was concerned, they didn't exist. Coupled with the fact they were still alive with their limbs cut off and that their wounds didn't bleed at all, the conclusion was obvious. His hunch had been right, they were definitely undead. As far as he knew, the only beings that counted as mindless for the purposes of mind magic were oozes, golems, creatures under the mind blank spell, and the so-called mindless undead. The boars were clearly neither golems or oozes, and he doubted mind blank was involved. It would also explain why they seemed to have no blood and felt no pain or hesitation. "Are you all right there? You kind of took the worst of that blast," said Zorian, shifting his attention towards the man he came here to save. Now that he was close to the man, he could see that Lukav Teklo was a fairly handsome middle-aged man, sporting long black hair, a carefully sculpted beard and rather muscular physique. Zorian was a little surprised by this, as he had expected someone wilder. After all, his fellow villagers had told him that the man disdained human contact and preferred to spend his time in the wilderness. Yeah, I'm all right," the man said, rising to his feet before swaying dangerously. Zorian quickly caught him and helped him regain his balance. "Damn it. Hoisted on my own petard, literally. Didn't even accomplish anything with it. Totally ignored my patented animal repellent. That's some compulsion they were under. I'm pretty sure they're undead," Zorian said. "What, really?" Lukav said, squinting at the closest boar. "My vision is a little blurry right now. Is it really trying to wriggle towards me still?" "I think so, yeah," Zorian confirmed. Lukav barked out a stream of words in some Kusky language that Zorian didn't recognize. He was pretty sure they were swear words, though, so maybe it was better that way. "I'm sorry," the man said after a few calming breaths. "I don't mean to be rude. I want to thank you, young man. I was lucky you happened upon me when you did. I surely would have died otherwise. Well, it wasn't entirely luck, Zorian said, causing the man to give him a hard look. You're a cave Teklo, yes? The man nodded. I have been looking for you based on the recommendation you received from one of my friends, one Kale Vranov. Ah, Kale. Lukav immediately brightened. Great kid, shame he stopped coming when he got engaged to that witch girl. I was hoping to recruit him as an apprentice, but I'm afraid Freya got to him first, and unlike her, I didn't have a cute daughter of my own to tempt him away with. Talented alchemist, that boy. I'd ask you how he's doing, but we can do that in my house, when I calm down a little. That would be fine, Zorian said. Though I want to take a look at these undead boars that attacked you, first. I'm pretty sure someone just tried to murder you. I don't think undead boars arise on their own. Oh no, definitely not, Lukav agreed. Mine are undead like that, are basically flesh golems, only with an enslaved soul or spirit placed inside instead of an automation core. The only naturally arising undead are ghosts and other soul entities. Alanik was always very clear on that. Not sure who would try to kill me, of all people, but apparently I pissed off a necromancer somewhere. Just my luck. I'll report this to the guild and have them deal with this, but feel free to examine these things as much as you want in the meantime. I'm kind of curious myself, but divinations were never my thing, so. Zorian nodded and got to work, using an alteration spell to bind the legless torso of the nearest boar so it wouldn't thrash and move around before moving to analyze it. As he feared, he didn't find out anything particularly useful and was forced to leave the scene to the guild investigators. At Lukav's advice, he resummoned the severing disc and chopped all of the downed boars except one into smaller pieces that no longer moved. Lukav claimed that one undead boar was enough for the guild investigators, and he didn't want to risk the attacker picking them up, sewing the legs back on and sending them after him again. The last intact boar was buried deep into the soil via another alteration spell from Lukav, there to wait for guild investigators to arrive. Zombies, skeletons and other undead are not nearly as easy to make as stories make them out to be, Lukav explained as they made way towards his house. Easier and cheaper to make than golems, sure, but still a significant expenditure of alchemical ingredients and time. Losing a dozen zombies like that has got to be a major loss for whoever is targeting me. No sense in letting them recuperate losses by leaving the zombie boars in fixable condition. Alanik told me to always destroy any disabled undead after the battle, just in case their maker is around to fix them back up. I didn't think I'd ever be in a position where that advice would be useful, but there you go. Forgive me, but is the Alanik you were talking about Alanik Zosk? Zorian asked. Why yes, Lukav confirmed. I suppose Kale recommended him too. Yes. He actually gave me a pretty long list of soul mages. You were just the first name on the list. He wasn't really, but it hardly mattered. The man motioned him to continue. I need your help with a piece of soul magic I got hit with. I don't feel comfortable talking about it here in the open. I hope you'll hear me out when we get to your home. Fair enough. But unless you got hit by a transformation curse, I don't think there's much I can do for you. Alanik is actually a better bet. He's no curse-breaking specialist, but he knows the basics of the field at least. Of course, it would have been even better to seek the help of the guild, but I'm guessing you have a good reason for not wanting to get them involved. I do, confirmed Zorian. And while I realize that the chance of you being able to help me is slim, hey now, those are fighting words, Lukav warned. I still hope you will hear me out and try to help me. It's entirely possible that you hold a crucial key to solving my problem, even if you are unable to give me a total solution. My problem is not a curse, exactly. It is exotic enough that Kale recommended Silver Lake as a possible solution if all else fails. Say what? Lukav asked incredulously. He recommended that crazy old witch as a solution for something. I know, Zorian sighed. I heard from a reputable source that she asked for a Grey Hunter exact from the last guy who asked her for help. Now that's just ridiculous, Lukav snorted derisively. Someone is pulling your leg. Not even Silver Lake would do that. Anyway, I'll see what I can do. It's the least I can do for someone who saved my life. Break. After they had reached Lukave's house, the man penned a quick report to the nearest Mudge Guild representative and paid one of the village boys to deliver it to MotherOfLearning while they talked. Apparently the kid was a very good runner and had done such things for Lukave in the past. Regardless, it took a full hour for Lukave to tackle Zorian's problem, during which Zorian explained Kale's rather tragic situation to the man, and Lukave gradually calmed down and waited for the potion he ingested to take care of his concussion. Horrible. I thought that hearing about Kale would cheer me up after this whole ordeal, but it only makes me feel even more depressed, Lukave said. Zorian stayed silent, content to wait for Lukave to continue. After a few seconds of being lost in his thoughts, the man shook his head with a sigh. Well, I think the potion did its work by now, since staring into the lamp no longer hurts my eyes and my head no longer feels like it's been stuffed with wool. Do you think you could tell me more about your problem now? The house has some basic wards to shut down scrying, but it's not professional work, just something I had a friend make for me. The village doesn't have enough ambient mana to support anything substantial in terms of permanent wards, anyway. I guess we could go to MotherOfLearning and hire a private room in one of the more expensive inns, but that would cost a pretty penny and I'm kind of averse to spending money like that. It's fine, said Zorian. He had already analyzed the man's warding scheme as practice and found it adequate. Slightly worse than Zorian could manage with a full day's work or so, but far better than a hastily erected privacy scheme that had been his original plan. After a few seconds to collect his thoughts, he began to talk. Telling the man about the time loop was absolutely out of the question, of course, but that didn't mean he had to be totally vague about his situation. He told him how he stumbled upon a fight between a lich and an unknown mage, and was caught in the crossfire, getting hit by an unknown soul magic spell in the process. The other mage dispelled it, but the damage had already been done. After spending several weeks sick, he seemingly recovered, only to find out later that the spell had left its mark on him after all. Here Zorian went a little vague, refusing to state what the consequences he noticed were, simply insisting that the issue was private. Difficult, Lukave said unhappily when Zorian was finished. Knowing what the consequences were is a pretty crucial clue as to what the spell actually was, you know? You are sure it has nothing to do with transformation? Absolutely, Zorian confirmed. Not even partial transformations? The man asked. Remember, not all transformations are total or involve obvious physical changes. The vast majority of magical enhancements are actually transformation, even if they only do things like increase your strength and agility, they all call upon attributes of some other creature to do their thing, transforming the user in some non-obvious way. I didn't know that, Zorian admitted. But no, it's still not a transformation effect. It's actually more of an out-of-body experience, with my soul periodically leaving the body and then snapping back to it. So magical augmentations are generally transformation magic? Is that why they always seem to ask for animal parts and the like? Astral projection? Lukave asked. Makes sense. Some soul magic spells definitely weaken the links between the soul and the body if used incorrectly, and you said the spell the lich cast on you had been botched. Not that letting the spell run its course had been a good idea, mind you. But some of the necromantic arts are just as dangerous if dismissed incorrectly as they are in their raw form. You're definitely right to seek help over this. And yes, the parts of animals and magical creatures are there to provide an example of what you want to the transformation spell. Eagle Eye spell literally gives you the eyes of an eagle, for instance. Transformation magic is very useful for such augmentation because it is very easy to reverse. It is? I thought transformation was dangerous, said Zorian. That was what they were taught in the academy. Well, maybe a little, the man admitted. But compared to the alternatives, it is incredibly safe. You see, when you cast a regular transformation spell on yourself you are essentially putting clothes on your soul. Don't look at me like that, it's what it is. Yes, the official term is transformation shell, but they're basically like soul clothes. You can put them on, see, and you can take them off. Even if you mess up the spell and can't turn back, or you get locked into an alternate form by a malicious opponent, you are still just a dispel or a curse-breaking session away from returning to normal. Your soul is still intact and unchanged beneath the transformation shell, and once the spell is gone you revert to your base form. The problem is that sometimes people overreach and end up transforming too far, so you end up with a mage, say, transforming into a troll in both mind and body and killing his entire family before the spell runs out of mana and he reverts back to normal. Or they attach the transformation shell too firmly to their soul and can't change back, and are then stuck in the form of a sparrow or something and can't talk to people or meaningfully interact with their environment. That's why a lot of people don't do transformation via invocations and rituals anymore, and just buy transformation potions from people like me who know what they're doing. No chance of messing up, just drink a potion made by an expert and you're golden. On the other hand, when you're literally messing with your body chemistry and using alteration on your flesh, you're usually doing something totally irreversible, LeCave continued. The human body is a complex thing, and I don't think anyone really understands enough about it to meaningfully improve it. Most potions that aim to enhance the real body with some exotic concoction are basically stimulant drugs with addictive properties or cause hard-to-cure damage if used often. And alteration spells that aim to alter the flesh directly have heavy drawbacks that make them hardly worth the effort and are often a total bitch to undo. I should know, I got called in often to help out with the fallout created by such magic. But we're getting off track. Come with me and I'll see if I can do something about your problem. LeCave led him into his basement, past several locked doors, until they reached a spacious underground chamber. The huge spell formula on the floor in the form of two circles, one large one and one small one, each of which was ringed by lots and lots of magical glyphs, was a dead giveaway that this was some kind of ritual room. The fact that the room was perfectly cubical, with identical dimensions in all directions, was a further confirmation. Flawless geometric shapes were always better for holding magic than anything remotely irregular, which was why a Kojin artifice featured a lot of circles, triangles, cubes, pyramids, cylinders, domes and so on. Other than the ritual circle on the floor, the room was empty and featureless, likely to minimize magical interference from anything else. Zorian hoped he would not have to get naked for this. He had heard some of the more delicate magical scans were actually bothered by clothes and the like, and wasn't at all enthusiastic about that possibility. Thankfully, LeCave's instructions didn't turn out to be that bad. Alright, leave any magical items on your person outside the room and then step into the center of the big circle, right into that big empty space, he told Zorian. Zorian was more than a little apprehensive about leaving his magic items behind, since that would leave him totally defenseless. Especially the three innocuous-looking steel rings he had hanging on a necklace tucked into his shirt. Those rings were the latest iteration of his explosive suicide device that he had been steadily refining throughout the restarts. Anyone could make an explosive device with a bit of spell formula knowledge, of course, but making them stable enough not to go off by themselves yet capable of going off on a moment's notice whenever he gives a signal. Shrouding the explosive mana core with enough divination blockers to make the bombs invisible to wards designed to detect those very kinds of devices, thus allowing him to take those things literally everywhere he went, including the tightly warded academy facilities. Making them small and convenient enough that they weren't a chore to carry around. Not everyone could do that, he was sure. In the end he decided to remove everything except the necklace. Getting killed by betrayal would suck but ultimately just be an annoyance, whereas getting stuck in some kind of soul mutilation ritual without means of suicide would be irreparably catastrophic. He just didn't trust LeCave that much, even if his empathy was telling him the man was honest enough and harbored no hostile feelings towards him. He quickly put his spell rod, shielding bracelet, bag of small explosive cubes kept for offensive purposes and the experimental automation core he had been fiddling with in his spare time into a small pile next to the door and walked inside. LeCave was already sitting inside the smaller circle, which also had an empty space in the center of it that could accommodate him easily. Zorian copied the man and promptly sat down on the stone floor inside the larger circle. He had a feeling this could take a while. Apparently Lucave's magic couldn't detect the necklace, because he said nothing about it. "You don't have any kind of soul shell on top of your soul," Lucave decreed after 15 minutes of examination. "I kind of expected that. The sickness you said followed the spell that hit you strongly hints that part of your actual soul was affected. Let's see if I can detect any foreign bits in your soul then." Now this was the part that Zorian definitely cared about. He had been wondering for quite some time how big of a chunk of Zack's soul did he end up with and whether it was having some kind of effect on him that he was unaware of. Hopefully Lucave would be able to shed some light on that issue. After more than half an hour of spellcasting and lots of frowning, Lucave was finally ready to give his report. "Weird. You definitely have something woven into your soul, but it's not like anything I've ever seen. Actually, you have two somethings. One is some kind of complicated bit of spellwork woven incredibly tightly into your soul, definitely not soul stuff but not something I recognize either. Very weird that something so complex could result from a botched spell. Not calling you a liar, but it doesn't make sense to me. The other something. Well, it's definitely a piece of foreign soul stuff fused into your own soul, but I don't think you have to worry about that much. It's not a spirit or some soul parasite, and it seems to have all but dissolved into your own soul. In a year or two it will be gone entirely, completely assimilated." "What kind of consequences will that have?" Zorian asked worriedly. "None, I think. Your soul appears to be converting it into just another piece of itself rather than trying to keep it distinct. So there shouldn't be any major personality shifts and you probably won't get any nifty abilities from whomever or whatever it was that donated a part of their soul to you. Though, I guess it is possible that the fragment had affected your personality to an extent when you first got it, before your soul had the chance to assimilate it sufficiently, and such influences may linger still. Do you think and act radically different ever since the incident?" Zorian frowned. "To be perfectly honest, yes, I am quite different from how I used to be. But I'm not sure how much significance to attach to that. The incident was very traumatic, and so much has happened ever since then." "I understand," Lucave nodded sympathetically. "Your life has taken a completely different course after your fateful encounter with the darker side of magic. You would have changed anyway, and any changes caused by the soul fragment would have been lost in the noise. If you want my advice, you should not worry about it. You are who you are right now, and the fragment is all but gone. If shifters can claim to be the same person after stapling an animal's soul to their own, then I'm not sure why a little nudge from a soul fragment should worry you." "It's in my nature to worry," Zorian said. "Though admittedly the fact the fragment will be gone soon does make me feel better." "Well," said Lucave, rising to his feet with an audible pop of his joints. "I'm glad to have allayed at least some of your fears, but this is as much as I can personally help you, I'm afraid. For the strange spellwork in your soul, you will have to talk to Alanik. He tends to be very suspicious of strangers and unannounced visitors, but I'll accompany you to smooth things over since you did save my life and all. Is there anything else you wanted my help with?" "Well, not really," said Zorian. "But if I can trouble you some more, what can you tell me about shifters? You mentioned them several times while we talked today. Are you in contact with the local wolf shifter tribe by any chance?" "No, not really," said Lucave, shaking his head. "I mean, I could locate them if I had a week or so, but I'd really rather not. Talking to them is annoying, and they don't like me very much ever since I tried to buy the shifter ritual off of them at one time." "Ah," said Zorian with some disappointment. "It's just that I also talked to Vani, the local scholar in Yazovtveri, and he recommended I try to contact the local wolf shifters for help. Do you think the idea has any merit? In terms of whether their soul magic expertise could have helped you?" "Maybe, though I wouldn't bet on it," said Lucave. "But I really doubt they would agree to help you. The shifter tribe he speaks of, the Red Fang tribe, is fiercely protective of their special magic and suspicious of anyone who takes an interest in it. Hell, they don't even talk to other shifter tribes about it. Having non-exclusive access to shifter magic is very prestigious for them, and they don't want to share it with anyone. Then why did you offer to buy it off of them? Asked Zorian curiously. Well, I didn't know that then, did I? How the hell was I supposed to know these things when they barely talk to anyone in the mage community? Groused LeCave. Okay, yeah, I may have been a little too insistent, but they could have explained things to me politely instead of making such a big deal out of it. I see, said Zorian carefully. LeCave probably wasn't the best person to help him contact the shifters, it seemed. Just as well, since he had a much likelier lead right now in the form of Alanik. He agreed he would drop by tomorrow in the evening to pick up LeCave, and that they would then go meet Alanik together. The two men were old friends according to LeCave, and Alanik would be easier to deal with if he was there to vouch for Zorian's character and honesty. Zorian hoped that the priest would be as useful as LeCave claimed he would be. Break. The next day Zorian spent an entire morning practicing the severing disc to make sure he could actually control it properly the next time he used it, switching to various levitation exercises when he got bored or ran low on mana. As evening approached, Zorian teleported to LeCave's village and spent an hour or so in idle chit-chat with a man. Zorian wasn't sure, but it seemed to him that the man had hinted at the possibility of teaching Zorian some of his secrets. Of course, there would probably be an apprenticeship contract involved if he wanted to take LeCave upon that offer, but with the time loop in place, such entanglements wouldn't be permanent in nature. Perhaps he should set aside a future restart or two to see what the man had to offer, but transformation magic simply wasn't a priority right now. He needed information and defenses against soul magic before anything else. Eventually, they both got on their way. LeCave had wanted to walk to Alanik's residence, but Zorian had vetoed the idea, arguing that would be a waste of time when he could just teleport them next to the man's house instead. Admittedly, his only experience in teleporting others had been when he had retreated from Vazen's house with Guri in tow, but he was confident he could replicate that success. And as it turned out, he was right about that. I'm surprised someone as young as you can teleport, LeCave said conversationally, looking at their new surroundings to determine where exactly they ended up at. They were not far from the temple that Alanik worked at and which also served as his home, but Zorian opted not to teleport too close, as LeCave indicated that the man could be somewhat trigger-happy about such things. You're, what, 16? I guess I finally met one of those kid geniuses people talk about. You're not that Kaczynski, are you? No, I just happen to have the same last name as Damon, Zorian lied. Figures, the man said. You must get that question a lot. You have no idea, Zorian sighed. Thankfully, Kaczynski wasn't that rare of a last name, and no one had accused him of lying when he denied any connections. Whatever LeCave had been trying to say next was promptly drowned out by the unmistakable sounds of explosions coming from the house in front of them, immediately followed by angry shouting in an unknown language and sounds of gunshots. Zorian quickly drew his spell rod and scowled. He had been afraid of this. Whoever was behind the disappearance of the soul mages had noticed their assassination of LeCave had failed and decided to throw subtlety out of the window and move fast to eliminate the remaining target. They no doubt knew that LeCave and Alanik were friends and that Alanik would soon know all about the assassination attempt. He cautiously advanced forward, LeCave trailing after him. There were no undead this time, probably because the target was a well-known undead hunter and was thus bound to be good against them. Instead, the attackers consisted of 15 men armed with rifles, probably non-magical mercenaries, and 2 mages acting like spell support. They were hesitant to simply storm Alanik's house, for some reason, and instead waited outside for something to happen. Unwilling to charge into a group of riflemen like idiots, both Zorian and LeCave settled in behind some trees to observe the group. They are trying to bring down the wards before they move in, Zorian realized after a few seconds. The mage on the right is trying to collapse the entire warding scheme. The one on the left is protecting him from all reprisals while he's busy, and the riflemen are periodically shooting at the windows to keep Alanik from raining down offensive spells on them at will. A ray of fire punctuated his whispered statement by erupting from one of the second-story windows, aiming for the mage who was dismantling the wards. The other mage immediately shielded his companion from the attack, and the rifleman responded with a withering barrage of bullets at the offending opening. "We have to help him," Lukav said firmly. "The only option I see is waiting for a good opening," Zorian said. "I don't see a way to get involved right now that wouldn't immediately get us both killed. Can you deal with the two mages if I take care of the gun-toting idiots?" Lukav asked. Zorian gave him a curious look. How did he intend to do that? Was he one of those idiots that still underestimated the effectiveness of guns even after the huge death toll they racked up against combat mages in the Splinter Wars? "Well?" Lukav asked, a little more harshly. Deciding to take some risk, Zorian skimmed the man's surface thoughts for a moment. He promptly realized that the man beside him cared deeply about Alanik and couldn't bear to see him killed if he could do something, anything about it. He was ready to move in with or without Zorian, but he honestly thought he could prevail against the riflemen. He was far less sure whether he could survive against them if he had to deal with the mage support as well, though. "I can deal with them, yeah," said Zorian. "Wait for 2 minutes before you charge in." He then promptly cast invisibility on himself and walked off in the direction of the two mages. He wasn't walking for the sake of being dramatic. The invisibility spell he was using was a very delicate optical illusion that required his conscious attention to maintain. Any sort of distracting activity, such as fighting or casting spells, immediately unraveled it. He couldn't even run without turning into a shimmering humanoid outline that was far more attention-grabbing than simply working up to the mages with no cloaking attempts. But a fast walk turned out to be sufficient. He was practically on top of the two mages when Lukav finally grew sick of waiting and charged into the fray with a battle cry. At least he thought the creature that came charging in was Lukav. The huge bull covered in dark green, fish-like scales, its eyes glowing with malevolent red light, seemed like something a transformation expert would use, and it sure as hell wasn't aligned with the attackers. The beast let loose a loud bellow that was laced with some kind of magical fear effect. Zorian ignored the mental attack easily enough, but 3 of the riflemen weren't as fearless and immediately fled screaming. The rest were shaken enough by the fear effect that they gave the bull a few crucial moments to close in before they started firing. As Zorian expected, those scales weren't just for show, and the bullets didn't do much. The 2 hostile mages beside him seemed to realize their forces weren't going to fare well against this new threat because the defender suddenly started to cast a spell and the wardbreaker sped up his work. Deciding that the defender was the bigger threat, Zorian decided to forego any fancy spellwork and simply pulled out a knife from his belt and rammed it harshly into the man's neck, dropping his own invisibility in the process. The other mage didn't react fast enough, too shocked at Zorian's sudden appearance, and received a swift kick in the groin a moment later. He immediately collapsed on the ground with a keening wail. After checking to see if any of the riflemen were gunning for him, they weren't, as they were too busy being trampled by the bull beast that Lukav had transformed into. Zorian reached into the mage's mind and blasted it with a crude telepathic assault. The man went unconscious like Zorian had been hoping he would, out of the fight. Before Zorian could decide whether he should get involved in the fight against the riflemen, it seemed unnecessary, and he wasn't largely immune to gunfire like Lukav was. A trio of flaming projectiles rained down from the 2nd floor and incinerated 3 of the riflemen that had been trying to rally the others. The bull beast let loose another fear-laced bellow at this, and the survivors promptly fled. Zorian watched them go, ready to erect a shield around himself if one of them decided to let loose a few parting shots. None of them did. The bull beast let out a derisive snort and kicked the ground a few times before suddenly folding upon itself, for the lack of a better word, and becoming a man. Specifically, Lukav. Man, transformation was more useful than he had figured it was. He understood why Lukav had been reluctant to engage the attackers without someone to take out the mages though. Without hands, the alchemist could not cast any defensive spells himself, and was very vulnerable to hostile magic. Any conversation was postponed when the short, bald, muscular man literally dropped out of the sky in front of them. It took Zorian almost a second to realize that this was probably Alanik Zosk and that he had jumped down from the freaking 2-story window. He looked unaffected by the fall, but still. "Hell, you idiot, I told you not to do that shit," Lukav yelled. "I almost firebombed you before I realized it was you." "You, boy," Alanik said to Zorian, completely ignoring Lukav's anger. "Why did you let those men go? You could have picked them off as they fled." "I didn't think it was okay to kill fleeing opponents," Zorian said, surprised at being put on the spot like that. "I don't know, it just seemed too bloodthirsty to just shoot them in the back while they ran." A short silence ensued as Alanik gave him a blank look. His mind, though unshielded, was incredibly disciplined and gave Zorian no insight to the man's personality and mood. He idly noted that one of the man's eyes was blue, while the other one was brown. There was a horrid vertical scar over his blue eye, which really looked like it should have destroyed it as well when it was made. "I see," he said finally. "You're young. What has that got to do with anything?" Zorian protested, annoyed at the man's attitude. "They just saved the man's life, for God's sake." "You haven't been fighting for long," he simply said. "You're inexperienced." "Yeah, well, you're an asshole," thought Zorian. But outwardly he just frowned instead. Yeah, Zorian could already see Alanik would be one of those people. He really had the damnedest luck. Break. Alanik Zosk turned out to be pretty calm about the full-blown assault on his temple by 24 gun-wielding mercenaries, refusing Lukav's demand that they go and report the thing to the nearest guild station right away with a dismissive statement that it was too soon to involve them. He even had the unconscious mage that Zorian had disabled transferred to the dungeon in the temple's basement. Why exactly did a temple have a dungeon? Zorian wondered but was afraid to ask, openly admitting he intended to have the man interrogated later. In the meantime, he wanted to know what Zorian and Lukav came to him for. No, he didn't need time to calm down. "Why do you ask?" Zorian had to admit he admired the man's composure, even if he was a rude ass. "Interesting," Alanik said after Zorian repeated the story he told Lukav. "Very well, I will see what has been done to you. Lukav, please leave the room while I examine Mr. Kaczynski here." "Just like that?" "Apparently yes." Unlike Lukav, Alanik didn't use any fancy ritual rooms, and the examination took all of 5 minutes before the man had pronounced his verdict. "You have a marker stamped into your soul," Alanik told him bluntly. "A what?" Zorian asked. "A marker is a combination of a beacon and an identification tag. It allows certain spells to find the marker very easily across great distances and unambiguously identifies whatever is tagged by the marker. They are often used by shopkeepers in fancier shops to track stolen wares, by high-security prisons and spies to track movements of marked individuals, and in construction of certain wards that allow people to be keyed in and therefore free of some or all of the restrictions that all other visitors labor under. Among other things, they are usually placed on items, as placing permanent markers on people is iffy and requires tattoos and such. Yours, though, is stamped directly into your soul." Zorian remained quiet, his thoughts turning. A marker. That was why he ended up caught in the time loop along with Zack, wasn't it? The spell wasn't keyed into the originator's soul or some such. Since those things were ambiguous and could fail, the original looper could end up with his soul damaged or slightly altered, much like what happened to him and Zack in the end, and then the spell could glitch and fail to loop them back like it's supposed to. No, the makers of the loop instead stamped Zack's soul with something unchangeable and unmistakable. And then Red Robe and Zorian inherited it, because the makers of the loop were a little too smart for their own good. Removing the marker, Alanik began, oblivious or uncaring about Zorian's obvious state of deep thought. "I don't want it removed." Zorian immediately protested, broken out of his thoughts. Alanik gave him a considering look. "I suppose you were fortunate then, because I do not think I could remove it even if I wanted to," Alanik said. "It is unlike anything I have ever seen. The marker is woven incredibly tightly into your soul, suffusing every corner of it. It is as if a chunk of your soul was replaced with it and it then grew to fill every nook and cranny it could find to root itself in as firmly as possible. Oh hell." He rose from his seat in agitation, pacing around the room. Alanik watched him impassively, silent and expressionless. until Zorian calmed down a little and sat back down. "I need more information," he said. "And I need a way to protect myself from things like this in the future. Can you help me?" Alanik nodded. "But tomorrow," he added. "For now I have a prisoner to interrogate." Chapter 032 Alternatives. Despite Alanik's proclamation that he was going to interrogate the prisoner, he did not immediately descend into the temple dungeon. Instead he started rummaging through a nearby cabinet full of potion bottles while Zorian slowly absorbed today's newest revelations, opting to remain in the room for the moment. He was not in the mood for answering questions that Lekave would have for him once he got outside, and Alanik seemed like the sort of person who would warn him if he was being bothersome. Since Alanik said nothing about his continued presence, Zorian felt he had tacit permission to stay. He had a piece of propagating, self-repairing magic lodged in his soul. Part of him marveled at the magical expertise of the person or thing that created the time loop system, but the greater part of him couldn't help but wonder what exactly was crammed into said wonder of magical spell design. Alanik's description, as well as Lekave's inability to identify the spell despite his advanced-looking ritual, painted a picture of something far too complex and lifelike to be a mere identification tag. This was important, he could feel it. He needed to know how the marker functioned as soon as possible. For one thing, if there was some kind of hostile contingency woven inside it, ready to screw him over once he tripped over some esoteric activation condition, he wanted to know about it. Not to mention that this particular piece of magic could very well be a key clue to understanding the time loop. What kind of secrets were locked inside of it? Kale had speculated that whatever spell had been placed on Zack to initiate the time loop had all sorts of safeguards and contingencies woven into it, and while the marker clearly wasn't the source of the looping magic itself, it sounded like the perfect place to put those safeguards in. Maybe it had the time loop instructions manual encoded somewhere in its structure? Well, probably nothing so convenient, but still. There was one thing that still bothered him greatly: if he had a marker in his soul that uniquely identified him as a time looper, why the hell hadn't Red Robe tracked him down by now? His enemy was a proficient soul mage, after all. Zorian found it difficult to believe he was ignorant of the marker mechanism. With that in mind, he should have had little trouble locating every single time looper, Zorian included. But he didn't. Why was that? "Mr. Zosk." Zorian spoke up. "Could you spare a moment, please?" "Call me Alanik," the priest said, stopping his inspection of the cabinet with an annoyed huff. Zorian got the impression the annoyance was directed more at the cabinet than at Zorian, though. "What is it?" "I know you said we'd speak tomorrow, but I'd just like to know how difficult it is to locate a marker like mine. How hard would it be for you to track me down with the best magic at your disposal?" "By tracking your marker? Almost impossible," Alanik immediately stated. "I'd need the original keystone from the maker of the spell to define the search criteria properly. That thing is far too complex for anything else." Zorian frowned. "Wouldn't having my own copy of the marker sidestep that?" he asked. "Well, yes, but that would require you to be right beside me and serve as a willing focus of the spell. A tracking spell that requires you to be right next to the target is functionally useless, wouldn't you think?" He suddenly gave Zorian a shrewd look. "But what you're really wondering about is not you tracking down the person whose soul fragment gave you the marker, but them tracking you, aren't you, Mr. Kaczynski?" "Calm, Zorian," he said. If the man wanted Zorian to be casual with him, he should show the same courtesy. "And yes, that is basically what I'm worried about. How easy would it be for another holder of the marker to track me down?" Alanik quickly walked over to a nearby bookshelf, plucked a plain brown book from its shelf and handed it to Zorian. "The spell you want is on page 43, Alanik told him. Zorian quickly leafed through the book until he reached the indicated page. The spell in question was not an invocation, but rather a 10-minute ritual. It allowed the caster to locate a specified marker based on the copy of the marker in the caster's possession, and it had a downright jaw-dropping range. If Zorian was reading this correctly, it could locate any and all copies of the marker over a circular area that extended well beyond Eldamar's borders. Yeah, it was not cheap in terms of mana use, It required enough mana that Zorian wouldn't have been able to cast it at all before the time loop, and even now, after 3 years of restarts, it would take a sizable chunk of his reserves. But still, for a nationwide search spell it was shockingly accessible. He supposed its very narrow search focus allowed it to be hyper-efficient about mana use. Really, the only possible deal-breaker was that the spell assumed the caster had a keystone imprinted with the copy of the marker, and would have to be slightly modified to switch the reference target of the spell from a stone held in the caster's hand to a marker stamped on their soul. Zorian sincerely doubted Red Robe was incapable of making such minor alterations to spells, though. I could be tracked from one end of the country to another, Zorian mumbled disbelievingly to himself. Yes, Alanik agreed. Possibly even further. I don't claim to have comprehensive knowledge of tracking spells, so there may be a version with even greater range. Your insistence that the marker must stay on was quite surprising. I hope you have a good reason for leaving a giant target painted on your soul. Ugh. I'm not happy about the situation, but I do. I really do. I'd also like to cast this tracking spell myself to see how many other people turn up in results, but we can deal with that tomorrow. I've already kept you from your interrogation long enough. Unfortunately, I seem to have run out of truth potions, the priest said unhappily, throwing a glare at his potion cabinet. Annoying. You can't buy those on the open market and it takes days for LeCave to make a batch. It seems I won't be interrogating anyone today. Oh. He agreed with Alanik, that really was annoying. He wanted to know who the guy was working for just as much as the priest did. He thought about offering his services as a mind reader to the priest but quickly shelved that idea. Aside from the very likely possibility he would make Alanik too suspicious of Zorian to help him with his soul magic problems, there was the fact that he wasn't sure how much help he would be anyway. His mind-reading skills were still very unreliable at this point. He'd feel pretty stupid if he outed himself as a mind mage and then failed to achieve anything of note. Better try that in some later restart, after he gave his telepathic abilities some polish. No matter. I will figure something out. I'm afraid I'll have to postpone our meeting for a day or two because of this, though. I'll send a message through LeCave once I have sorted my business in order. Agreeable? Sure, Zorian shrugged. Just don't die before we meet again. Whoever wants you on LeCave dead can clearly throw a lot of resources at the problem, so they're unlikely to stop now. The same goes for you, young man, Alanik scoffed. You seem to have an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Suspicious, that. If I were in the attacker's place, I would definitely make sure to get rid of you before trying again. And no offense, but you look like a much softer target than me. Not having much to say to that, Zorian simply bid the man goodbye, had a brief conversation with LeCave outside the room to inform him of everything and then went back to his room at the inn. He would sleep on things before making any decisions. Break. With the next several days freed up for his own activities, Zorian decided to go visit Silver Lake and see if the capricious old witch was in a better mood to help this time. The trouble was, he could no longer find her cottage. His memory was extremely good, and he remembered exactly where it was in relation to surrounding natural landmarks, but when he physically got to the location there was nothing there. No cottage, no witch, nothing. As far as Zorian could tell, it wasn't an illusion and there was no ward in place messing with his mind to stop him from noticing it. He detected no mental tampering, his area-wide dispels revealed no optical flickering, and he physically passed through the area that the cottage stood on in the previous restart and met no resistance whatsoever. How the hell did she do that? Dimensional shenanigans, maybe. Like a pocket dimension that can intersect with reality under some circumstance or something. Whatever the exact mechanics, he clearly wasn't going to reach Silver Lake's place without her inviting him first. Considering that last time it took him several days of wandering around and almost dying to get her attention, he decided to not bother with that and find something else to do. Namely, investigating the rest of the disappeared soul mages. While it was true that Alanik seemed to be his best clue at the moment, it wouldn't hurt to check the other locations as well. Thus, while waiting for Alanik to contact him again, Zorian proceeded to break into the homes of each of his targets before combing through them with every divination spell in his arsenal. The knowledge he picked up from Guri's little escapade was quite useful here, as a number of those homes were warded against entry and divinations, and that would have given him quite a bit of trouble in the past. What he found out wasn't much, but it did put at least one question to rest: the attackers had indeed been active long before the time loop started. 2 of the houses showed signs of a struggle, and forensic spells dated those signs about a month to a month and a half before the start of the time loop. In addition, the house of the old curse-breaking herbalist lady looked pristine on first glance, but Zorian easily detected evidence of repair magic used on furniture and sloppily erased blood splatter on the walls, both dated 3 days before the start of the loop. Zorian silently thanked Slush for his divination instructions. Without them, he would have never been able to tell such things with any degree of certainty. He also made sure to search the houses for anything personally interesting while he was at it, and here he had greater success. The herbalist lady had intact notes about her curse-breaking side business. Zorian pocketed those, even if he wasn't able to make use of them at the moment. She also had a pretty extensive journal that listed where to find rare plants in the nearby forest as well as detailed some of her rare recipes. Zorian left it alone for now, but made a mental note to show it to Kale at some point and see if it was worth something. The ransacked tower turned out to have been imperfectly ransacked, and Zorian managed to find 2 different secret compartments that the attackers missed. One held a trio of high-quality combat staffs and a stack of blasting rods. The other held a bunch of spellbooks containing combat spells, specifically, the sort of combat spells you couldn't buy legally anywhere because they were far too effective and lethal for the Mage Guild's taste. Naturally, Zorian swiped all of it for his personal use. He found more interesting stuff in other houses, but nothing he felt like taking at the moment. The familiar obsessed guy, for instance, had mountains and mountains of books and journals dedicated to soul bonds, magical creatures, and familiar-related magics. It was interesting, but not something he needed at the moment. In the end it was 5 days before Alanik finally contacted Zorian again. If Cave didn't insist that his friend was alive and well, just unusually occupied with something, Zorian would have feared the attackers got him. Regardless, Zorian soon found himself seated in front of Alanik, ready to finally discuss things. "I apologize for the wait," Alanik said. "I'm afraid that the confessions I managed to force out of the prisoner had far more far-reaching consequences than I had initially suspected." "Oh. I don't suppose you could tell me what those are?" asked Zorian. "I'm afraid not. It's not something you should concern yourself with," Alanik said, leveling him a mild glare. Fine, I get it," Zorian said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Truthfully, it did not matter much because he already knew what Alanik had found out. While the priest seemed to have some sort of natural mental defense, his friend Cave didn't. Zorian had simply pestered the transformation expert about the prisoner and read the man's thoughts wherever he refused to answer. Basically, the mage Zorian incapacitated was hired by none other than Vazen, the man who Guri wanted him to spy on in the previous restart. Worse, the man appeared to be just an underling himself, with the real ringleader being someone more highly placed in the local hierarchy. Someone capable of interfering with the police and guild investigations. It was certainly an interesting piece of information, and Zorian had some suspicions of his own about Vazen now. The man had concluded some kind of deal with a company in Seoria, so it was entirely possible he was connected to the invaders somehow. He had intended to have another go at those documents anyway, but now they acquired a whole new importance. Good, Alanik nodded. What did you want to start with? Well, first of all I'd like to know if you could help me defend myself against soul magic in the future, said Zorian. Why wouldn't I be able to help you with that? Asked Alanik curiously, cocking his head to the side slightly. I was told that spellcasters without some measure of soul perception can only cast the most rudimentary of soul magic, said Zorian. And from his attempts to duplicate Kale's spells, he knew that to be largely true. The only spell he managed to learn from Kale was the one that cloaked him from the soul perception of other necromancers, and Kale claimed that was baby stuff. Ah. You've been talking to a necromancer, I see, Alanik said. Zorian winced. It seemed like a logical course of action. I had a soul magic problem, and he was a soul mage. HMPH. Necromancers, began Alanik, taking pains to stress the word, have a habit of targeting others with their spells, so of course they consider soul perception to be absolutely essential for their craft. If you just want to cloak your soul in some protective effect, it is hardly necessary to go to such lengths. Oh, is that why he could cast Kale's soul sight and visibility spell but not the rest of his arsenal? Even for other things, it is possible to use lengthy rituals to get around that requirement. I believe you've already experienced an example of such a ritual when Lucave tried to determine what is wrong with you. Don't be fooled by his lack of skill. Lucave is but a dabbler in this branch of magic, and if you dedicate yourself to the discipline you could end up much more impressive than he is. But I'm never going to progress beyond unwieldy ritual setups without soul sight, am I? Guessed Zorian. Alanik sighed. Yes. But soul sight is too much of a temptation. It makes soul magic too easy. For the sake of your immortal soul, I implore you to turn away from that path. It is not necessary to go that far just to protect yourself. I see, said Zorian. Out of curiosity, do you have soul perception? For the first time since Zorian met him, Alanik looked uncomfortable. Yes. But that's different. Of course it is, Zorian thought. Do as I say, not as I do, just like it always was. But he didn't say that. Instead he asked Alanik what exactly he was willing to teach him. There are two ways I can see this going, said Alanik, quickly regaining his composure. Option 1 is that I teach you how to perform a plethora of protective rituals to foil hostile soul magic. They are, as you say, cumbersome, casting times can be up to 2 hours long in some cases, and setting up a ritual isn't easy. They last a long time, though. Weeks if you perform them correctly. The advantage of this path is that you get a way to defend yourself right away. I'm fairly certain you could do the beginning rituals as you are now. Also, some of the rituals will allow you to affect souls other than yours, though none of the rituals I'm willing to teach you can be used on an unwilling target. And the disadvantage is that if I'm ever caught unaware by the enemy, I'm screwed because there's no way to shield myself on a moment's notice, finished Zorian. Exactly. That's where option number 2 comes in. With the help of some meditation exercises and special potions, I can teach you how to feel your own soul. If you hone the skill to a required level, this skill will allow you to cast any soul magic that has you as its target. You'll be able to shield and analyze your soul with invocation spells, and it might even allow you to passively notice when someone is messing with your soul in some fashion. I like that option, Zorian said. I figured you might, Alanik scoffed. The problem is that this option isn't some quick power-up. It will take you months to reach usable levels in this skill, and that's assuming you have the patience and willpower required to perform the exercises every single day for months on end. I do, said Zorian curtly. We'll see. I should also mention that until you master the skill of sensing your own soul, this option will leave you just as helpless to soul magic as you are currently. Yeah, that's a little dangerous, Zorian admitted. Still, the second option sounded way more useful and functional than the first one. Maybe if he wasn't stuck in the time loop he would blanch at the idea of spending months of his life like that, but right now it was looking like a bargain. I suppose there's a reason why I can't learn both at the same time. They are both demanding skills in their own way, and I don't trust you to be capable of juggling them both effectively, Alanik said, his tone brooking no disagreement. Fair enough, Zorian said. He was going to visit the man in future restarts anyway, so he could potentially just pick different options on different restarts. How about this? You teach me the very basics of the soul rituals, the things I can pick up well enough as I am now, and then we immediately switch to the personal soul awareness project. I suppose I can live with that. You should note that the basics of soul rituals won't do much for you, Alanik noted. That's fine. I'm mostly interested in option number 2 anyway. The reason I want the basics of soul rituals is because I still want to cast that marker tracking ritual you showed me, and modifying it to work with a thing attached to my soul is probably going to require some working knowledge of soul magic. Probably, Alanik agreed. Well, now we come to the make it or break it question, Zorian sighed, fixing a weary gaze at Alanik. What exactly are you asking of me in exchange for all this? Alanik rolled his eyes. Don't be so dramatic, boy. Teaching people how to defend themselves against necromancers and hostile spirits is a part of my calling, as far as I'm concerned. I'd take a whole class to teach if people were actually interested. Unfortunately, such threats are considered something of a minor issue in the aftermath of the Necromancer's War. So while yes, I do intend to send you on an errand or two, it isn't going to be anything too onerous. Lucave tells me you can teleport. I can, yes. Excellent. I was thinking of sending you out as a courier from time to some of my more distant contacts. Nothing difficult or dangerous, just delivering some letters and packages for free. Half an hour later, Zorian had managed to hammer out some kind of agreement with Alanik. Overall, Zorian felt the priest had been quite generous in his terms. His principal demand was that Zorian had to show dedication, or else Alanik would unceremoniously terminate the lessons and kick him out. Specifically, he had to show up at the temple every evening like clockwork, and show diligence and enthusiasm for the lessons. Right. Oh, and there was the whole business with him being a courier from the priest on occasion, which was of little concern to Zorian. He thought of it as teleportation practice more than anything. Well then, Alanik said, leaning back in his chair. Now that this is all done, we can begin with our first lesson. What, now? Zorian asked in surprise. Is there a reason to postpone things? No, I'm just surprised. Most of my previous teachers have been. Well, no matter. What are we starting with? Break. Over the next 2 weeks Zorian continued studying the other disappearances while attending Alanik's lessons. He absorbed the basics of soul protection rituals in a few days and then moved on to the meditation exercises needed for a personal soul sight, only to find out two things. First, the meditation exercises were incredibly, mind-numbingly boring. No wonder the man was worried about Zorian's dedication. He could easily imagine someone dropping that after only a few days. But no, Zorian was stronger than that. And besides, he really needed that skill. Secondly, those special potions Alanik mentioned? What the priest hadn't clarified at the time, and indeed, hadn't explained before Zorian actually drank one, was that they were extremely powerful hallucinogens. Almost immediately after downing one, Zorian was assaulted with a cacophony of strange, incomprehensible sights and smells. Sounds become distorted and unrecognizable, and his thoughts degenerated into a chaotic mess. It was a profoundly unpleasant experience, and once Zorian finally came to his senses and stopped drooling all over the floor of the temple, the jerk could have at least put a pillow under him. He felt a powerful desire to punch Alanik in the face. The man had effectively drugged him helpless and was completely unrepentant about it too, claiming that without the help of those potions the entire process could take years. He would have to drink one of those once a week, apparently. Which was all well and good, but it still didn't explain why the man hadn't warned him what would happen when he drank that potion. Personally, Zorian suspected schadenfreude. Aside from the whole potion incident thing, there was one tiny little detail he had failed to consider when he decided to accept Alanik as his newest personal tutor. Alanik was a priest. Priests were, generally speaking, very religious people. It stood to reason, then, that they'd be very bothered by people who don't care much about their own religion or have some gaping holes in their understanding of religious dogma. And with Zorian spending every evening in the temple, it really was too much to expect that Alanik wouldn't notice just how lacking Zorian's religious credentials were. The good news was that Alanik wasn't going to get rid of him because of this. The bad news was that he took it upon himself to correct this glaring deficiency. Thus, not only did Zorian have to suffer through boring meditation sessions every evening, they were now interspersed with long-winded lectures about the gods, angels, spirits, and man's place in the natural order. Heaven help him. Or not, he supposed. He doubted the angels would have a lot of compassion for someone in his position. And thus, with the evidence that the gods have fallen silent no longer possible to ignore, and the unescapable fact that no more miracles would be forthcoming, the Holy Triumvirate decided to loosen the limitations on soul magic, a decision that did much to soften the blow of the silence, but one that would have far-reaching negative consequences. But I can see that you are starting to lose focus, so we will continue this tomorrow. Thank the gods. Zorian quickly vacated the temple before the man could have a chance to change his mind. He was barely out of the temple gates when he realized he was walking into an ambush. It was a crow that tipped him off. It looked normal enough, though it was curiously brave in not fleeing at his approach. He had, however, gotten into a habit of automatically scanning the minds of every animal he saw as telepathic practice, and the crow in question didn't have any. That immediately raised an alarm in his head and he stopped, expanding his mind sense to maximum range. In the next second he threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets that ripped through his previous location. Almost reflexively, he fired 2 force missiles in quick succession. One at the undead crow that had taken flight while he dodged. He didn't need that thing pecking his eyes out while he was busy elsewhere, and another one straight into the air, seemingly at nothing. That one was what Avon called a screamer, a missile that produced a loud, shrill scream as it flew through the air. Zorian hoped that the noise would give pause to the ambushers, at least for a moment, but the real purpose of it was to attract Lennox's attention and tell him there was a fight going on outside of his temple. You know, just in case the gunshots weren't clear enough on that. The first bolt collided with the crow, causing it to erupt into a shower of feathers and fleshy bits but no blood, but the second one didn't have much effect on the attackers. Zorian was forced to immediately erect a shield in front of himself to tank a powerful beam of shining force, and was then pinned in place by a withering hail of bullets. He had to pour half of his mana reserves into strengthening the shield, but it thankfully held. Also thankfully, the attackers had a piss-poor sense of tactics. Apparently the entire force wasted their ammo on the initial barrage, and thus couldn't provide any further fire to keep him pinned in place while they reloaded. Zorian promptly took advantage of this to take cover behind a nearby tree, become invisible, and then vacate the area as fast as he could without breaking the optical cloak. It was a good thing he did, because the tree he had been hiding behind soon became a target of a massive fireball that reduced it to charcoal and did horrible things to everything around it. These people really didn't pull any punches, did they? Tracking his attackers' movements with his mind sense, Zorian could tell they weren't fooled with his maneuver. They knew he wasn't dead, and they were coming after him. Welp, time to exercise the better part of valor and teleport away to safety. A few seconds later, he sighed in resignation. Of course they erected a teleport ward around the area. Well, if that's how they wanted to play then so be it. Closing his eyes, he located the nearest gunman with his mind sense, connected with his mind and then hit him with the best telepathic attack he could manage. He felt the target stop immediately, but apparently he'd failed to knock the man out. No matter. He disconnected from the man's mind and moved on the next one and repeated the procedure. He grinned nastily when he felt the man's mind shut down from the strain, the gunman falling unconscious. Then he moved on to the rest of the ambushing force, attacking their minds one by one. 2/3 of them were strong enough to weather the attack, though they would likely be dazed for a while and suffer a nasty headache for the rest of the day, but a full third found Zorian's telepathic attack too much for them. Sadly, the mage that supported them figured out what was happening and shielded his own mind against the tactic. Still, even if he didn't get them all, he succeeded in taking away their momentum and slowing them down. It cost him, though. His telepathic powers, exotic as they may be, were still magic. And like all magic, they used mana to power themselves. His empathy and mind sense didn't seem to cost him anything that he could detect, and establishing a telepathic link with another was trivial in terms of mana expenditure. Even for him, it was so minute as to be unnoticeable. But these telepathic attacks he had been doing? They were incredibly cheap, especially considering their effectiveness, but he had performed a lot of them in quick succession. He was almost spent. He sure hoped Alanik got off his ass sometime soon, preferably before the mage could rally his forces and come after him again. Suddenly, just as Zorian was about to start booby-trapping the place like crazy, another group of people teleported in and his heart sank. Well, that just wasn't F-wait, they were fighting the first group. Huh? It seemed Alanik had called for the cavalry. The sound of gunshots and flashes of spellfire filled the air again, but this time Zorian wasn't the target. Zorian wisely decided to sit this one out, being mostly out of mana and not wanting for one of the newcomers to confuse him for an enemy and put a bullet in his head before he had a chance to explain. 10 minutes later, the noise quieted down and Zorian made his way back to the temple. There he found Alanik talking with a mixed group composed of a 4-man group of guild battle mages and a small contingent of Eldamar soldiers. He was questioned on his role in the battle, but the fact that Alanik vouched for him kept the man in charge of the group from dragging him back to the guild station for questioning. Apparently Alanik had quite a lot of pull with the Mage Guild. He was worried the attackers would blab about Zorian's telepathic abilities, but apparently they were under the impression Zorian cast some kind of area-wide knockout spell rather than assaulting their minds directly. The leader of the guild force even commended him on his restraint when faced with deadly force. Alanik gave him a severe look though. Zorian wasn't sure if he did that because he figured out there was something fishy about the whole story or because he disapproved of Zorian's soft approach. He knew from previous conversations with the man that Alanik firmly believed in tough justice and striking back at threats as effectively as possible, so he might just be annoyed that Zorian had not used something more lethal. Eventually he was given permission to leave, though warned not to leave his current accommodations in Yazov Veri for the foreseeable future and beat a hasty retreat back to his room. Break. When Zorian reached his room, he felt totally drained and wanted to do nothing more than to crawl into his bed and sleep until tomorrow. That had been intense. He thought he'd have gotten used to having his life targeted and being in life and death situations, but he apparently wasn't anywhere near that mindset yet. The questioning that followed wasn't really pleasant either, and he suspected he had overextended his mind a bit with his last stunt because his thoughts felt slightly more sluggish and fuzzy than they should, even taking his tiredness into account. But no, he couldn't go to sleep yet. Today was significant in that he had finally finished modifying the marker tracking spell with Alanik's help, and he wanted to test it right away. His mana reserves had recovered by now, so he was good for a try. He quickly fished out one of the wakefulness potions he had made over the last week and downed it in one go. His head cleared out almost immediately, and so he promptly started creating the ritual circle with a handful of salt and powdered quartz. After the circle was made and triple-checked for faults, he slowly went through the ritual, mindful not to mess it up since it would take a large chunk of his mana reserves whether it succeeded or failed. The moment he spoke the last line of the ritual, Zorian was suddenly given a sense of the location and distance of all markers within the range of the spell. All 2 of them. One was in the very center of the search area, that was him, obviously, and the other was far to the south, somewhere along Eldamar's southern border. Zorian freely admitted he had not expected that. He had expected the ritual to locate either 3 markers or just one himself. How can there be just 2? Was one of the other time travelers out of range? Did he misunderstand something? He would have to repeat the ritual at different intervals to see if another marker popped up at some point. On the very beginning of the next restart, certainly. But if the number of markers remained stubbornly at 2, then that would mean that at least one of the time travelers didn't have the marker. Probably Red Robe, because Zorian was sure that Zack had one. It would explain why Red Robe didn't just make a beeline for Zorian when he realized he existed, and why he felt the need to ask Zorian how many other time travelers there were and who they were. But that would mean that Red Robe became a time looper through some other mechanism than Zorian did, wouldn't it? Nothing can ever be simple about this, can it? He sighed, rubbing his eyes. No matter. His immediate goals remained unchanged by this new complication: learn how to protect his soul, become a better fighter, and polish his mind magic into something usable and reliable. His mind drifted to the battle he was caught in today and he nodded to himself. His performance wasn't flawless, but he got out of it alive and the growth of his skills was undeniable. Despite all the issues he encountered, he seemed well on his way to achieving his goals.